Ladies and gentlemen, common values, common goals, welcome to our panel discussion on the state of transatlantic relations in anticipation of President Obama's visit to Berlin. Our panel discussion is part of our series Rethinking Tomorrow, hosted by the Hertie School of Government and by the Deutsche Welle. On behalf of both institutions, it's my great pleasure to welcome you. I think we have a fantastic panel today. On my left, Judy Dempsey. She is columnist of New York Times and the International Herald Tribune. She's author of a book about Angela Merkel. I will quote the title in German, Das Phänomen Merkel, Deutschlands Macht und Möglichkeiten. And she is editor for Carnegie Europe. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Ben Scott, he was advisor to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and he is expert, and this is very interesting today in our discussion, expert in the intersection of communications technology and foreign policy. Welcome, Ben. And last but not least, instead of Harald Leibrecht, who is very busy in the German parliament at the moment, so the parliamentarians are really working hard. Instead of him, I welcome David Schwake. He's deputy director of North America desk of in the Federal Foreign Office. Welcome, David. And I'm Gero Schließ. I'm the senior foreign correspondent of Deutsche Welle in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Later. Obama is watching us. He's watching you. Of course, he's watching you and also me. Hundreds of millions of phone records and online communications are gathered by the National Security Agency. Chancellor Angela Merkel will raise the issue with President Obama when he visits Germany next week. And I would like to direct my first question to Ben. Ben, you were policy director for free press in the Obama administration. Did you know about this surveillance program?
No. I'm happy to say that I was not briefed on this particular classified program while I was at the State Department and learned about it as you did in the newspaper.
Were you surprised?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, no.
Could you elaborate?
I think that this is an area like many at the intersection of technology and foreign policy where technology has advanced beyond the framework that was anticipated by the law. So you can see a similar phenomenon in drones. See a technology that has evolved, that has become a very influential and important part of foreign policy, and it operates in a legal framework that never anticipated this capability. So the big question in that scenario, as well as in the recent discussions about surveillance technology, is what is the appropriate legal framework to contain the technology? You cannot put the genie back in the bottle. The technology is not going to go away. It's not just the United States who has this capability. It is most developed countries, including the one in which we sit. The question is, what do you do with these tools, under what circumstances, and who decides under what criteria? And these, I think, are the questions that will now be answered by all interested parties in the aftermath of these news stories.
You were part of the Obama administration. Are you disappointed now?
Well, that's a bigger question.
I know.
I would say, anytime you have a president who you've served, there's obviously a strong loyalty. And I feel that this president and this administration has done many very important things for the country, has established the United States reputation and rehabilitated it in many ways around the world. Progress is measured in very demonstrable ways. Has this White House and this government achieved everything that I would have hoped? No. In part, that's a lack of idealistic enthusiasm, but it's also a part of the politics of Washington, and it's a part of the circumstances of geopolitics. And so I think, you know, as an idealist and as a citizen, I always wish for better than I get. But as a realist and a cynic with 10 years in politics, I can appreciate progress when I see it.
German politicians, as we all have read in the newspapers, are angry about getting to know in the newspapers about these surveillance programs. They say it's not in accordance with the rule of rights and with democratic values. Judy, have Germans and Americans common values on this crucial point? Difficult question.
This is common values. I'll start off on the basis that the Europeans and the Germans and the Americans, we do have common values. And in fact, we do have shared interests. But it is the interpretation and the defense of those values and how you reconcile them with the interests, and as you mentioned, the whole difficult question of realpolitik. On the whole issue of PRISM, we have two issues here. The actual scale of it, and the fact that the NSA had access to Google and Facebook. And I would like to hear what the audience think. I'm sure Google and Facebook and the others, and Skype, especially Skype, which I thought it was really impenetrable. I mean, there must have been some degree of knowledge of what was going on. It's hard to know. It's hard not to believe that all those techies working for these companies did not know that something was being siphoned off. So the scale of this is just enormous. And to be able to even, how would you synthesize all this information? It's simply mind-blowing. Now, I'm not ducking your question. The Europeans have this sense of outrage and so on. But frankly, the Europeans signed up to the passenger names registration data April of last year, sharing all the records with the US administration on anybody flying across the United States. This took a lot of negotiations, and all the names are kept in the computers, I think for 6 months, and then they go to a different level, and then to another different level of accessibility. So Europeans, you know, we have cooperated quite a lot with the Americans on this. It hasn't been transparent. And to cap it all, the European Commission, which really want more and more powers, now they're thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could monitor all the people leaving Europe and coming into Europe as well? So this is more than the law running after the technology. This is about the exercise of power. And using the whole threats of terrorism or crime and others to actually impose more controls over individuals. It's not a very healthy sign for a democracy. It's very, very difficult to balance interests and democracy, but I think this is a very important issue, and it is about civil liberties. And if the Europeans want to, sorry to be so long, at the end of the day, it's going to be tough for Obama. It's going to be tough for any European leader to go to the Chinese, to go to North Korea, to go to authoritarian regimes and say, these are our values. And the Chinese will say, or the North Koreans, oh, really? Spying on your citizens? That's what we do, too.
David, as Judy mentioned, PRISM and the other programs were mainly directed to Europeans and to other foreigners. Is this acceptable for the German government? And does the government want to take action?
Well, I think as you quoted in the beginning, the German government has expressed that it's not happy, and I think this Mrs. Merkel's spokesman already said that she's going to raise it with President Obama. So obviously the government is not happy and was not aware of what was going on. At the same time, I think if you have institutions like the NSA, you shouldn't be surprised about what they're doing. Yeah, the extent, of course, was surprising to everybody, but nobody can claim, I think, that we didn't know that spy agencies do this type of activity. Yeah. The question is whether, for example, like from a German legal point of view, whether Google and other companies that are also based in Germany, whether they violated German law. Yeah. It seems that they didn't violate American law. And then when it comes to values, I would like to add that, of course, we share the same values, but I think we should also recognize that data protection issues, privacy issues, are not as important in the US to the US public as they are to us in Western Europe, certainly not in Germany. I read a poll this week that I think 55% of Americans more or less accepted this type of surveillance.
Yeah.
At this point, I would like to open up a discussion to you. You have the opportunity to ask questions, and I would like to invite you to ask questions to our panelists. When you do this, please stand up and introduce you to the others here. So, who would like to get a mic?
Hi, Keshav Jimri. I'm a student at Stanford University. My question is, just to start things off on, for all the panel, at what point is it justified to sacrifice civil liberties, supposedly, since we are at a war with terrorism or something like that? How much civil liberties is the right amount? And I don't mean this in a loaded way. You can say none at all if you like, but it'd be interesting to see if there's a line when you think, okay, the NSA can do this much. Maybe they can't collect mass data. What would be your opinion on that?
Okay, who wants to take a question? Ben?
You, I think, have put your finger on precisely the right question, which is, of course, not a new question. The balance between liberty and security has been vexing for democracies since they were first attempted. And the tricky bit of finding the right balance between liberty and security in the internet age is that what might be the right balance for the American public may not be the right balance for the German public or the Chinese public or the Russian public. But because the internet is a global communications medium, you have to reckon with the fact that someone else might make that decision about balance for you. And how do you address that conflict, those tensions? And there are no easy answers to that question. There are no easy answers. And I think ultimately, like many of the most important questions in international relations, it boils down to developing a common normative understanding over time, which is, I can tell you as a former diplomat, incredibly unsatisfying in the short term, because you don't see a lot of progress. You see a frustrating lack of results. You see people talking endlessly in circles around tables in acronym organizations, and then everyone goes home and responds exactly to their domestic politics. The poll that he mentioned earlier, I think, speaks directly to your point. 56% of Americans say, and they say spying is a part of our balance between civil liberties and security. And I'm not sure how you resolve that question when you have differences internationally.
Judy, coming back to a question, and we are discussing common values. So would a guy from Germany answer different as Ben just did? So have we common values in this case?
We have common values, and the common values traditionally and historically and culturally which binds us is the common values of individualism. And we have to bring in the issue of civil liberties and the media. And what has happened with those values, especially since 9/11, is two fundamental things. As a European, excuse me if I speak sort of generally, as a European, we simply have no idea of the impact 9/11 had on the Americans. I went back to the States just to work about 2003. It is so wide, the gap between of the understanding the impact of 9/11 on the Americans compared to us. We had the terrorist attacks in Spain, we had them in London, and we have a different attitude towards it. But I can completely understand this poll, but there's a very high price for this. If you compromise civil liberties, the basic civil liberties of the right of the individual, of habeas corpus, of if you're going to be detained, you must, these are vital, vital things. And even England is going down, Great Britain is going down this slippery rope of abandoning habeas corpus. If you go down this road, you actually compromise the fundaments of democracy. And by doing that, you actually denigrate your whole the whole system which you're trying to project as what you would like other parts of the world to be. It's not a satisfactory answer, but we must always, when we do talk about security, we have to ask, how is it going to affect the basic freedoms? And secondly, do these huge security measures, do they actually produce results? Do they actually stop terrorist attacks?
More questions? Okay.
Ricardo Sanchez Blanco, Embassy of Spain. Thank you. Just to shed some light on PNR. It was very difficult to negotiate it between the European Union and the United States. But at the end of the day, the European Parliament, as it did in the case of SWIFT, SWIFT is the name, for those who are not informed, is the one for financial transactions. And it was agreed, agreed that they had to have some limits, the way the information was shared with the United States. And I think that's the key of sharing information, of knowing. On the 1st of December 2009, it was the first day of the Treaty of Lisbon. And then the European Parliament became a powerful institution, a more powerful institution.
Your question?
They had the same powers as the others. The day before, it was agreed by the other institutions that SWIFT, the information was going to be transmitted to the United States without all these hindrances. And the first thing the European Parliament said, hello, I'm here, I have enough powers, and I don't agree with that. And then they sent to Washington several representatives to control several things. That this information was only used for terrorist purposes, or to control terrorist purposes. That it was going to be it was not going to be so transmitted to third countries. That it was going to have a limit, and the people whose information was going to be transmitted would have the right to defend themselves. So I think it's important to shed light on this, but because this is a very accurate point of how information is going to be used and abused. Thank you.
Judy.
Well, I see which way you're coming from. Strong believer in the powers of the European Parliament, but they're not strong enough, perhaps, or else they're too strong. I will. And before this, before the Commission particularly got its way over the passenger names register, 3 months before, the Commission actually gave up its right. Under pressure, and I think Ben might know this, Kerry's brother, who was in commerce at the time, I think, they sent over a swathe of very senior officials to Brussels, and actually the Commission caved in and gave them the right to actually extract certain data, the emails and other surveillance of the telecoms companies in Europe. And the Europeans did it for very complicated reasons. They're looking for better trade relations and so many other things. But it was a very uneven trade-off. And this story never became public until today in the Financial Times. So, I mean, there's a lot of things the Americans don't know what we're doing, or what the Europeans are doing, what others are doing. And it is a question that actually, even though we have common values, I think the level of trust is not very deep at the moment.
David, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is the latest project. It had been proposed by President Obama in his last speech, and it will be probably negotiated this summer. Is this a framework for negotiating also surveillances of personal data and the other issues we mentioned?
I don't hope so.
You don't hope so?
Well, let's say I hope that this will not come in the way of TTIP. That's what I want to say. We will start negotiation this summer, and it will take, I think, 2 years probably, maybe 3 years. We have the feeling that the Americans want to get it done before the end of the Obama administration. But it will be very, very complicated, and I think the current discussion on passenger name records, data, surveillance, and so on will complicate the negotiations. But yeah, as Ben has said, technology is advancing so fast, and there are questions that 10 years ago we just didn't think about it, issues that we didn't think about it. And what do you do with a credit card number that you give to an American firm in Europe? What will happen with the data and so on? So these are extremely complicated issues. And as it has been said, we have to find the right balance. If we want globalization, if we want freedom of movement, then we will have to accept that some of the data that are being produced are also been looked at. We face, for example, the challenge that the Americans threatened us to reintroduce visas for Europeans if we do not provide certain data in advance. So what do? You want globalization, you all want to go to the US without having to go to the American embassy before and ask for a visa. But we pay a price for globalization, for this freedom of movement, and the price is that some of the data are being looked at. And then again, we have a choice: either we agree to this, and as in the case of the passenger name record, we make sure that at a certain point, let's say 5 years later, all these data get deleted, or we just accept that there are no rules. And we have no control on what's going on with the data. And the general tendency is, of course, that we try to find common ground with the Americans on what we do with these data.
I think the discussion about the surveillance programs is very important, and maybe it will be part of TTIP negotiations. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Terrible if it was. I mean, we would never get anywhere. The trade. I mean, I hope you're right, it'll only take 2 years. But this trade agreement, if it happened, it would be so exciting. It would be a new transatlanticism of a mega order. It would be, I hope I'm not being idealistic or naive, but it would export serious liberal values about economies, the movement of goods, the movement of people, the movement of capital. I mean, we have bizarre rules between the US and Europe at the moment, plugs, patents. This is the real world, this is globalization. So I really hope this comes off, and I hope the French won't, I know maybe there's some French here, well, I hope the French won't really put their veto on for culture. Culture doesn't die through economies, through globalization. Culture gets exported and strengthened. And also, if we ever got this new transatlanticism, which is sorely needed because of the mess of NATO, it would really, could be the start of something very important, how transatlanticism could have a role in other parts of the world. I mean, it's a very exciting project, and very exciting for Latin America, what it could show for them too. That's my hope.
Ben, you don't look so excited at the moment.
He's unexcitable.
How do you think about TTIP?
Well,
So still the transatlantic trade and investment partnership.
I agree that it has huge potential, and its impact could be very beneficial for a large number of communities that have been disadvantaged up to now. Getting from here to there will be very difficult. Very difficult. A lot of parochial interests will get in the way, but on both sides of the Atlantic. Both sides of the Atlantic. It's very difficult to get around what is important at home in order to facilitate what might be important together internationally. And I think it'll be a very big political challenge. Like many international agreements, the actual facts about why transatlantic trade are beneficial are not in dispute. It is merely the process of getting to the place where those facts can be realized that is quite difficult. And I agree that if some of the more controversial issues are taking center stage, it could really easily derail the whole thing. And I've been in enough international meetings, I've seen that happen. We'll watch and see. There are, I think, a lot of capable people who would like to see this happen, and they're willing to make compromises. But domestic politics have a way of intervening.
To consider it from a more globally point of view, look at China, look at Latin America. What are the political and economical benefits for you?
For the United States?
No, also for Europe, for the transatlantic community.
Well, I mean, it's a moment in time when both North America and Europe are looking for the engines of economic growth that will take them out of post-industrial malaise into post-industrial innovation. What do those look like? How do you ensure that the movement of capital is fluid? How do you make sure that the individuals with great ideas for tomorrow's markets are given the opportunity and encouraged to develop new businesses? Who's creating those jobs? In principle, all of those issues are improved if you have lowered the barriers to entry and expanded the addressable market for any given country. I mean, if you think about the wild enthusiasm that greeted Neelie Kroes's announcement that a single European telecommunications market would mean no roaming charges when you move across borders with your mobile phone. Everybody in this room can appreciate why that would be awesome. Now expand that sort of enthusiasm to other markets that you understand less because it's not sitting in your coat pocket everywhere you go. The same kind of sort of logical extensions can happen in all kinds of different markets and bring benefits to lots of different people. Now caveat that by saying, you know, free trade unregulated is not a magical fairy that sprinkles progress on everywhere it goes. You have to be conscious of environmental concerns and labor rights and all of the issues that have always been difficult to negotiate in trade agreements. But I think this is where the common values of North America and Europe will come into play. This is where that actually has a stronger chance of being less of a factor than it is when you're negotiating in other parts of the world.
David.
Yeah, I would like to add, for us, I think from a strategic point of view, the common standards that we would have to agree on are very important too. You mentioned sockets or plugs. If we agree on a common plug for, I don't know, electric vehicles, then this will be relevant for China, for India, for others too. And they will produce according to these standards. So we can really set standards. If we don't agree, then they might among themselves agree, or the Americans might agree with the Asians and so on. So I think strategically it's important to agree on standards in order for them to have a global impact. And then of course the second strategic point is that since the end of the Cold War, we have a great relationship with the US, but we have no common project, if you will, no big project. And TTIP could be such a project that people get excited about and that could bring us together again much closer, I think, than before.
So I would like to open the discussion again, the panel discussion, to the audience. Do you have a question at this point? Please.
Pilanim Tembu from the Graduate School of Global Politics at the Freie Universität. From what I'm getting with the discussion, is that the TTIP more important strategically for Europe than it is for the United States? And I link this now to the question that you pose with, you know, the stage of the partnership, of the transatlantic partnership. Common values, common goals, but question mark with common goals. And with this now taking place, I got not as much enthusiasm from Ben, not as much enthusiasm. Just from what I'm seeing here, can I read more into that with the stage of the transatlantic relationship?
Do you have a second question? You can collect. Okay, then first Ben, Judy, David.
Very perceptive listener. While I don't pretend to be an expert economist, much less a specialist in transatlantic trade, I don't think you need much more than newspaper knowledge of this trade agreement to see that the benefits for Europe perhaps outweigh those for the United States in today's economic climate. I think the export economies of Europe that have traditionally dragged the euro higher against the dollar and against other currencies and created positive growth in GDP across the eurozone need more places to ship their stuff. Just that simple logic suggests that the TTIP will create an opportunity for economic growth in Europe that is currently not there, and in a moment of stagnation that is awfully tempting. I think, it wouldn't take but 6 months of economic reversals and a sudden panic in the stock market and Wall Street that sends the Dow plummeting from its record highs of 15,000 to make that op-ed thesis reverse. But right now, I think you're probably right about the perception politically about who benefits from what. And if that perception stays, I think it will impact who has what kinds of leverage at the negotiating table.
Judy.
Except, Ben, I'm not, the administration would not walk into this thinking that only the benefits would be one way.
No, I don't mean to suggest that
yeah.
at all. This is clearly something that the U.S. government wants quite a bit.
Absolutely.
And it's a broad mutual benefit. The question is, in today's political circumstances, both sides want it. Who needs it, and who needs it faster? Those are sort of, I think, the priority questions.
In this respect, I mean, Europe does need growth, but the growth from Europe will not come alone through trade. It will have to come through competitive economies. And there are a number of very, very slow, almost bankrupt economies, as you well know, in the Eurozone, which entering the Eurozone could have been a mistake in the first place. And even if there was a huge push for trade both ways, trade itself doesn't create competitiveness.
No.
It does create competition, but it doesn't create competitiveness. I'm talking about education, I'm talking about retraining, I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about getting rid of the layers of the bureaucracy, a leaner civil servant. I mean, it's huge, the idea, the agenda that Chancellor Merkel has set for these countries. Excuse me, rather the EU has set for these countries. But, I mean, it's very complex. It is very complex, but if the trade agreement did happen, I think on the idea of strategy, it would be, from the strategic point of view, it would be something fundamentally radical for the transatlantic relationship, because we don't, as David said, I mean, there isn't a common thing anymore 22 years after the end of the Cold War.
David, it's your turn.
Well, I could add, I think what will complicate the issue is that the benefits are very unequally distributed also among the Europeans. Germany, as the biggest export economy in Europe, will benefit, there's no doubt. And that's why we are more ready than others to compromise, I would think. But that's not true for the Greeks or the Portuguese or the French or others who have large economies that are based on agriculture, for example. So it will be very, very difficult also to find, and we're doing that right now, a common mandate for the negotiating team then to negotiate the trade agreement. And then we have to get probably all 27 parliaments to agree and the European Parliament. So it will be extremely difficult. Also because, as I said, like the benefits are distributed unequally. But we certainly have a huge interest. As you said, I think I read a statistic or prognostic that said that there will be about 400,000 jobs created in Europe and about 190,000 in the US. Yeah, but that might go up and down depending on the stage of the economy.
To come back to Ben's skepticism, Ben, do you think that politicians are skirting the controversial issues like security issues, other issues, in favor of trade? So is this a project which politicians in the US and here like to skirt other discussions?
Are they skirting those issues? Well, if by skirting you mean trying to keep security issues out of the economic trade agreement, probably, and logically. if you mean skirting to that they are ignoring the security issues even on a parallel track, I would say no. The security issues, if anything, are more front of mind than they have ever been, certainly in my political life. But I think there's a strong effort to keep those tracks of discussion separate for obvious reasons.
Judy?
I think the security, my definition of this, when we just discussed the security relationship in terms of between the US and the Europeans, actually I think it's pretty miserable. I'm not talking about PRISM or anything like this. I'm talking about the whole unwillingness by the Europeans to take on more of the burden sharing. And this is something the Americans, rightly so, have been asking the Europeans to do. And now it's come to the crunch that the Americans are serious about the strategic shift to Asia. I mean, Asia was always on their agenda, but it's more pronounced now. And how many secretaries of defense have come to Brussels and said, look, Europeans, the party's over. I know you've got problems with defense spending in the Eurozone, but you've got to spend more wisely, you've got to invest more wisely, you've got to pool your resources, you've got to take much more of the share of looking after your neighborhood. And we don't. And I find the security discussion in Europe so, not so much intellectually lazy, I find it blind. I mean, the Americans have been as upfront as they possibly can with the Europeans, but the Europeans have collectively, they have refused to address this issue. For the first time in 7 years, the EU heads of state will hold a summit on defense in December. Isn't that astonishing? 7 years. We've had since then the Arab Spring, we've had Georgia, we've had the rise of China, we've had Mali, we've had any numerous other conflicts, and we've had our heads in the sand. If I was an American, I would be extremely worried about Europe's responsibility over the security issue.
David.
I have to say, I don't agree. I think,
of course.
First of all, if you look at the security issues, yeah, most prominent Syria, then there's Iran, of course, Afghanistan, you mentioned Mali. I think we Germans and I think most Europeans agree with the American point of view and the American strategy. So we have agreement. And we didn't have that, let's say, under President Bush or in former times. Yeah, on many of the most prominent security issues, we agree. There's, of course, a point, I think, where you're right on burden sharing. And I think that in the long run, we will have to do more. But that's difficult for politicians in Europe. Yeah. If you ask Germans how much do you want to spend on defense, do you want defense to go up or down, I would bet that 80% of all Germans will tell you defense has to go down. And it is going down. So Germans don't like to spend money on defense, and I think few peoples in Europe do that. So my prognosis is that only if we have a conflict in the Balkans or wherever, where the Americans don't step in, we will have to step up to the plate. So we need a challenge, if you want, and hopefully we won't get it. The exception was, one exception was Mali, I think, where the Americans stayed away. And the French, I mean, they didn't contribute, but they took the lead. And the Americans didn't even assist a little bit, but they didn't lead. So I think that for the time being, the Americans have no reason to complain.
Ben, do you have reason to complain?
Well,
let us know.
It's not me personally, but I think that the asymmetry in security capabilities between the United States and Europe is unsustainable. Because for too long, Europe has benefited from the United States' willingness to bear the financial and political burden of the most unpleasant of the world's political conflicts that often turn violent. The Mali case to me is an exception to the rule. It is the exception that proves the rule, rather. It is a relatively isolated case. If the Mali intervention had turned into a regional conflict with other groups in West Africa, there's no way the French could have handled it on their own. And then what happens? What happens if Washington says, we're not going? What happens when if there is a crisis in the Balkans and there is no European military capability sufficient to solve the problem? then you have a real conundrum. And there's major pressure in American politics to also reduce defense spending, because we have mortgaged away all of our social investment, our infrastructure investment, in order to maintain this massive security apparatus. It can't be sustained. And there was a very interesting discussion at the Munich Security Conference in February about how economics will change the security dynamics and force the hands of either the Europeans or the Chinese or both.
Yeah.
And this comes down to shale gas and energy. Fracking and shale gas will, in the next 20 years, by many projections, produce energy independence in North America, which will, for the first time, free Washington from the obligation to see any conflict in an oil-producing region as critical. It will also likely dramatically drop the price of a barrel of oil, which will destabilize these petro regimes that rely on massive influx of oil money. So then what happens? If the geopolitical incentives for the US military is to stay out of the conflict, what will be the answer to that geopolitical problem?
I would like to invite the audience to join us now. Our discussion on security issues. I think it's your opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. Who wants? I think security is very important. Yeah, actually, here. Yes. Maybe the lady.
Florentine Koppenborg, student at the FU Berlin. And I was just wondering, in case of a crisis in Asia, say, for example, in the South China Sea, how much help and support do you think the American side would expect from the Europeans, and what kind of support?
I don't think that they would expect any kind of physical support, military support, because we don't have these capabilities. Certainly not we Germans, and I don't see anybody else in Europe who could get engaged there soon. They would get political support and so on. And I have to say, we try after the so-called pivot to Asia, everybody realized the Asia is getting more important for the US. So we try at a regular basis to discuss with our US counterparts also Asia and how we can get involved and so on. But it's difficult, it's far away. And again, all politics is local or domestic, if you want. And the German public expects troops to come home from Afghanistan. They don't expect them to, fight for Taiwan or for an island that they have never heard of. So it's difficult for politicians to understand that this is an important region for them, even though we depend on trade with China and so on. But it's still far, far away and very difficult to communicate to the public. But at least I think politicians understand that this is getting more important. At the same time, I can tell you there's the Shangri-La dialogue on security issues in this region. And I think this time Minister de Maizière was scheduled to go, but in the end he didn't go. But it's such an important conference. I think no German minister has ever attended the conference. It's really difficult to get this to the stage where politicians and major decision makers understand that this is important and that we should be present there.
Judy.
It'd be very interesting. One has no idea how the South China Sea will be resolved, the issues. And the Americans are very worried about the accessibility aspects, how the Chinese want to block certain access by the Americans. What I would be interested in, that if a conflict did arise, precisely because Germany, for instance, Britain less so, is so now, its trade is so focused a lot on China, how the German government actually might react. It'd be very difficult, this balance, how Berlin might react. That's the first point. And secondly, over the past couple of years, the 27 members of the EU have each drawn up their own security strategies. 27. There isn't one European one, by the way. And it's worth reading all of them, because except for perhaps the French and I don't think there's even a mention in the defense guidelines, the recent one of last year, there isn't a mention of Asia. They are inward-looking and very, very parochial. which actually should be disturbing to the US, although we do have to look after our own region. But even at that, there's no coherence among these 27 strategies. They are very, very national, and what the Poles say in their strategy has nothing in common with what the Spaniards say. So in other words, we have no common strategy, and even more worrying, if a crisis did break out in the South China Sea, would the Europeans have actually a common reaction and a common voice in supporting the US?
But I think the South China Sea is a particular interesting case because it's among the most politically difficult to see the way through. But even if you take the cases that are difficult but more straightforward, let's take the states where we have at least the possibility of an unstable government or the fact of an unstable government and a nuclear capability. Iran, Pakistan, North Korea. And let's take examples of internal conflicts where a humanitarian intervention is called for, like Syria. To me, the tragedy of the Syrian case is that it seems that no amount of blood is sufficient to draw an international response that is military because there is no incentive to become involved in that conflict. And there is only, without American military power, there's no way that any European state is going to step into that conflict, despite the grandstanding that you might see. And I'm incredibly sympathetic with their views. I feel like this is one of the great tragedies of our time when we're watching it happen in slow motion. There's no security solution to that problem. Similarly, if Iran, North Korea, or Pakistan becomes an active nuclear threat, Europe will be a part of that solution but cannot be decisive. If I were a European citizen, I would be concerned about that.
Is the German government concerned about that? And isn't there an urgent need, David, to develop new strategies when you listen to Bernd and to Judy?
I think it's also important to be modest. We have to address certain issues, but I think it's obvious to everybody who can read the numbers, looks at our capabilities and so on, that we will not be a big player when it comes to dealing with North Korea. And it would be, I think, idiotic to try to do that. Burden sharing must also mean that we share certain tasks. For example, we don't have the capabilities, for example, to intervene in Syria to make sure the chemical weapons don't get into the wrong hands. We just don't have them. We know the Americans probably have it, and maybe Israel could do that. Germany has, I mean, if something like that would happen, Germany would have to take on another role. So we have to focus on the areas where we're really good at, and that's probably not intervening militarily. And we cannot, outarm the Chinese. Yeah. It won't, or to build up the capabilities to deal with the Chinese-Taiwanese conflict in case there is a hot conflict, I think is nothing that we should try to do. It's just not, it will not be our task, and it would be not reasonable to do it, and we could never fund it. So we also have to find our place as Germany and as the European Union, and that means that we will not just be the US, and we will not have the capabilities that the US has. That does not mean that we shouldn't maybe do something more and also make sure that our systems remain compatible. That's also another a big problem, that sometimes different systems cannot communicate any longer. But yeah, I think in general we have to be modest and see what we as Germany can do.
I would like to invite you to ask your questions, please.
Just very quickly to that, what exactly can we do? You've said quite a lot what we can't do. There's a military intervention. What could what is this going to be like? People supporting in the media? Like, what else can they do?
In terms of what conflict?
Well, any conflict. You mentioned that Germany doesn't have the military capacity to help in a military way. What could it do? Is this just showboating, or can it do anything?
No. I mean, for example, in Libya, we are now working on dismantling chemical weapons. And I think once the chemical weapons in Syria are somewhere in safe hands, we could contribute to that. or let's say in terms of the Middle East peace process, it's obvious that once they come to an agreement, then there has to be an international force to secure the borders maybe, or to, secure whatever agreement they have. And there, I think Germany would have to do something, maybe send troops, send peacekeepers and so on. That can be our role. But to intervene militarily in the conflict, like the Syrian one, as a nation, of course not. We could never do that. But even as a group of states, it would be very, very difficult.
How about using the technological capability of armed drones and a supercharged surveillance system to stop terrorism before it happens? Would those be within the Europeans' capabilities? This comes all the way back again to where we began with from what policies flow out from your values.
And also, I mean, this idea you have to be modest. Wouldn't ambition help? You know, there simply is no strategic or security ambition thinking in Europe. There are very, very few exceptions. I mean, in London and Paris, if you read the white paper, the French white paper at the moment, I mean, because of their past, of course, as colonial powers, they have strategic thinking, and they do think strategically. But we are talking about even Mali, which is our doorstep. Nobody wants to admit this. What happens when Bouteflika dies in Algeria? I mean, the potential for instability on our southern neighborhood, we have to think strategically. We have to have ambition. Modesty is not enough in terms of dealing with these threats, which are on our eastern neighborhood and our southern neighborhood. China is far away. We have enough threats here, and we're not even dealing with them.
But to come back to the transatlantic dialogue and common values, common goals, do you think that Germany can act eye to eye in this dialogue, keeping in mind what David said? Judy, and then. Yes?
You're in a very uncomfortable position because you're a diplomat, you see. So you could
that's what getting paid for. That's what you paid for. Yeah.
But, so I have to do some of this running around. So I'm going to be very frank. I think it is, of course, the German outlook, the German security outlook, and its so-called strategic outlook is influenced by the past. There's no doubt about it. But you can't use the past to stop pulling Europe together to come forward with a much stronger, coherent security doctrine. And Germany has actually put the brake on drawing up an EU security strategy because it would mean dealing with relations with Russia. Britain has stopped this too because we would have to discuss Britain's problem with Europe. The French wanted to do it, remember when they were heading the EU presidency, I think it was 2009, it went nowhere. And Catherine Ashton, the EU foreign policy chief, she doesn't want to precisely because she fears the disagreements. And we have our ally in Washington saying, Europe, what are you doing? We need to know. The Americans need to know. The Americans need to know where we are strategically, what our interests are. We know what our values are. It's how to defend those values and what are our common interests. And we know what the American ones are, but the Americans have got no response from the Europeans.
I think the most common sort of realpolitik critique is exactly along those lines, that Europe wants to be a global peer of the United States and China on economic issues and firmly in the backseat on all security issues. The question is that a sustainable policy? There are all kinds of reasons why it is unrealistic in the current state of affairs for Europe to suddenly develop a military capability. And I didn't mean to suggest that I think you should suddenly switch your defense budgets on par with the United States. I also think that would be foolish. But there has to be something in between where we are now and such an extreme reaction. And what that looks like is a series of bad options. And I think it's important to set in context the debates over drones and the debates over surveillance systems and the debates over some of the more unpleasant things that have recently been developed in counterterrorism. Those are all set in context of the alternatives, which are military conflict. And none of these things are none of these things are appealing. No one wants to do these things, but I think most principled people who are not in favor of any of these activities. And yet, at some point, to defer responsibility to produce any kind of solution simply cedes it to someone else who may be less principled and may be more pressed in the moment to solve a problem in a way that is worse than what could have been done with planning and forethought.
But David, we have already done a lot, maybe, that people think like that. Germany has strengthened its army. Germany discusses drone programs at the moment. It's at the moment very unpleasant for the Minister of Defense, as you know. So where are the next steps?
I want to very briefly say three things. First of all, I think we have interests, but we also have an identity as a country, as a state. And we do politics and security policy in terms of our interests, but mostly, I think, in terms of our identity. As a peaceful trading nation, trading state in the middle of Europe that doesn't want conflict with anybody and has a certain past. And it's very difficult for politicians to change that. Then the second is, I think, when you look at Afghanistan now, the coast of Lebanon, the coast of Somalia, the Balkans, German soldiers are there everywhere and have taken a leading role, at least in the Balkans. That's something that 20 years ago, nobody would have thought of. I mean, yeah, we didn't participate in the first Iraq war, but paid a couple of billions at the time, because it was unthinkable even for a conservative chancellor like Helmut Kohl to send troops into Iraq. And 20 years later, you see them pretty much all over Europe and parts of Asia even. Yeah. And I think this will go forward. And the third thing, when it comes to building common European capabilities, common European strategy, and so on, Germany is always in favor of it. There's no doubt about it. But it's complicated when it comes down to technicalities. Yeah. For example, the German-French brigade, we have one. We have never used it because it's difficult, to use it. In France, the French president can just send the soldiers. In Germany, of course, you need Parliament you need to consult Parliament. You need approval by Parliament. You need a mandate. So it's very difficult for us to react fast. And the same is true with common capabilities like drones. We have different legal systems. So all this is, even if you have the political will, it's difficult to implement it.
To come to visit Obama's to Berlin next week, I know that you are involved in the preparations for the visit. What can you tell us? Will they discuss the issues we are discussing at the moment? So what will be on the list? I
mean, we as the Foreign Office prepared talking points and so on for the Chancellor's office, and they asked us for background information on 46 different topics. So it's,
tell us 10.
Yeah, and that was for PRISM. Yeah, this was for PRISM. And so there will be a huge list of items on the agenda, and as the spokesman of the Chancellor has already said, PRISM seems to be also on the agenda. TTIP is another one, and then of course Iran, Syria, Afghanistan are the issues that everybody is talking about right now. Yeah.
What's the most surprising issue on the agenda
there was nothing that was really surprising to me.
I think it was surprising that Obama confirmed to come.
Yeah, I think it will be very interesting to see what he has to say at the Brandenburg Gate. Now in this climate where everybody talks about PRISM, and last week we talked about the drone issue, and then there's the past with the speeches that John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan gave. So there's a lot of history and some baggage, if you want. So I think it will be very exciting to see what he has to say.
And I know you have still strong links to the Obama administration. Do you know what he will say here in Berlin?
Nothing that I haven't read in the newspaper.
I don't want to.
One thing that I want to underline here is we've spent most of the last hour talking about the ways in which the United States and Europe have strong disagreements and don't see eye to eye on key foreign policy and economic issues. But I think we shouldn't look past the fact that on the vast majority of things we do agree. And I think it is telling that Barack Obama is coming to Berlin, one of the first visits of his second administration. Doesn't have to come here. He's coming here very deliberately because the importance of Germany as the center of economic leadership in Europe is central to American interests. To strengthen the relationship between the United States and Germany is a major part of what he sees as a priority. Those are all very positive things. And so even as we disagree over the right balance of resources, whether it's in military or diplomatic contexts, it's in the spirit of assuming that we want to cooperate and collaborate. That's the underlying assumption that no one questions, and I think we should all be very glad for that and continue to encourage that baseline foundation of cooperation, which allows us to have friendly disputes from time to time.
Judy, you have written a book about Angela Merkel. I don't say Angela Merkel. It's her name in the US. So how do you expect will both Obama and Merkel interact? They're both politicians with a very pragmatic sense of politics. How will they interact?
They're both very different too. I mean, they took a long time to get some chemistry going, especially during the first administration. And Obama went out of his way to woo Merkel, you know, to deliver some goods, not always the austerity package. The Americans were quite unhappy with Germany's handling of the euro crisis, and Obama, you know, gave her a wonderful, prestigious prize. She made her a speech in Congress, and Obama was saying, "Well, come on, I need something in return," and leaving aside Libya, which was kept separate. So the relationship was very, very difficult in the beginning. They're both very different personalities, and Obama's immense charisma, if I just notice, see him on television and so on. But now I think we've turned the corner, and especially in the second administration, and Merkel and Obama do have to find common ground on how they're going to get the European economy up and running. What I find very interesting is that Obama coming in the middle of an election campaign. That's what I find very interesting. Last time he came, wasn't it?
2008.
Just before 2000, before the elections in 2000, yeah. and she wasn't. Excuse me, she wasn't going to have him in front of the Brandenburg Gate. But I mean, it has changed now, and I think they realise, you know, Washington does realise that since Merkel does hold, and the Germans, unfortunately, the taxpayer do hold the money strings for keeping the eurozone together. Do you know what I would love? The Foreign Office is never going to invite me back.
Okay.
I would really, really love to be a fly in that room. And I would really like President Obama and Chancellor Merkel together to have a really interesting policy towards Russia. This is our big neighbor. And this is a big problem for the US, not only the arms control and other things. I mean, we're sitting on this, we have to deal with Putin for the next 3 or 4 years. And I would be very interested, leaving aside the euro crisis, I'd be very interested if the two of them, because Merkel is very interested in Russia. And she's changed the CDU thinking on this. But I would be very interested to know if they could get a common strategy on how to deal with Putin's Russia.
I would like to invite you again to ask your questions concerning the talks of President Obama here in Germany. By the way, will he also meet politicians from the opposition party, from Mr. Steinbrück?
Yeah, yeah. I think the American perspective is that the campaign hasn't really started yet, and indeed we will have the summer break after his visit. But he will meet opposition leaders as well.
But he will want to be in the Hertie School this time. No. So, have your questions concerning the visit of President Obama, this exciting moment next week in Berlin, to the panel? Not really.
Maybe we should ask our American friend if he had to draw up the speech, Obama's speech.
Yeah.
He's written it already.
What the main messages would be and how you deal with Kennedy and Reagan and so on.
I think you can count on a certain quotient of soaring rhetoric and references to history, which will be appealing and yet not particularly connected to the most contentious issues of the day. I expect he's very, very good at that, Barack
You
Obama.
are too.
We're well trained. I think that his primary purpose is and will be economic. The U.S. economy, for the first time in many years, is finally headed in the right direction. I think that when he speaks with all of the German leaders in all of the parties, one of his primary messages will be, hey, we get that you have an election coming up and there are certain things that you have to do between now and September. We just had to do those between now and November. But as soon as the election's over, we have to get serious about looking after our neighbors and making sure that the euro crisis is stabilized, to make sure that your economy gets back on its feet, to make sure that it doesn't drag ours back down with it. Spirit of partnership with a little bit of self-interest thrown into the mix. But to do that, I think there are all kinds of positive opportunities, not least of which is transatlantic trade agreement. If it's done properly, could really benefit both sides pretty tremendously. But I think the economic messages are unlikely to be overshadowed by any of the security issues or even the PRISM story. Obviously, those have become too prominent to ignore, although I would not expect that they will get as much treatment as many journalists would like them to.
One question over there, I think.
Hi, hello. My name is Kai. I'm from Stanford University as well. There's been a lot of talk about how Obama is coming to Germany, and it's very symbolic how his coming to Germany symbolizes the importance of the economic relationship between Germany and the United States. But I'm wondering, since TTIP is very high on the agenda, how Obama's coming to Berlin is going to strengthen ties with the US and Europe and not just Germany. And in the future, for example, with defense policy especially, how Europe is going to come further together to create a more consolidated defense policy as opposed to the 27 different defense policies as mentioned before.
So what was your question?
So there are two questions. First is how Obama's visit is going to, I guess, improve the US relations with Europe as a whole and not just Germany. And the second question is, where is Europe heading? What are the next steps in terms of consolidating the defense policy?
I think we start with David, go to Ben, and then to Judy.
First he's going to the G8 in Northern Ireland, and there will be meetings between US officials and European officials, or Commission officials, to talk about TTIP. I don't know whether he will have a bilateral with the Commission President, but I would assume he will. The second question on defense, well, we have talked about it. I think the most effective engine to get Europeans to get their act together would be a major crisis with the US not intervening. And hopefully we won't see that. But in the Balkans, for example, for me it's difficult to see that the US, for example, would intervene again in a conflict like the Kosovo as they did 10 years ago. Probably today they would tell us, yeah, this is your backyard, you have to deal with it. And then we would have an incentive, we would have enormous pressure to do something. And that could give us maybe the energy that we need to overcome all these obstacles that we have right now. But hopefully we won't have a crisis like that. And if we don't have one, I don't see that we will make huge steps in the direction anytime soon.
Ben.
He wants to intervene.
You want to intervene?
Couldn't it be said that once the crisis happens, that it'd be too late?
Yeah.
Wait for the mic, please.
Sure.
Couldn't it be said that once a crisis happens, it would be too late to start consolidating a defense policy?
Yeah, that's a potential risk. Yeah.
Ben.
I think you have to see diplomatic engagement as a multifaceted operation. Just think of the president's visit to Berlin as one element in a broader engagement with many European leaders in many different ways. I think the military-to-military engagement at senior levels happens pretty much constantly. And the pressure and encouragement to develop a tighter security policy in alignment with American interests is not something that is done in a kind of dramatic state visit. It's done all the time, everywhere, in each capital city where there is representation of American military interests, which in Europe, of course, still remains pretty significant. The other thing that I would say is there's, I think, broad concern that that exact scenario that you lay out not occur. And if you look at what's happening in Syria, you could look at that as a tragic foreshadowing of what is to come in terms of global conflicts in a geopolitical context where no one has the will or the capability to intervene. I think it is notable that Barack Obama has appointed Susan Rice as his new national security advisor and Samantha Power as his new ambassador to the United Nations, both of whom are among the administration's most vocal advocates for a liberal security policy that sees humanitarian intervention as a legitimate reason above and beyond strategic interests to intervene in global conflict. I expect that this indicates a broader theme that will be communicated both by the President in the G8, in meetings with Chancellor Merkel, as well as by other administrations officials across the relationships with many European governments.
Thank you very much for your question. And David, thanks for reminding me about the G8 in Northern Ireland. It's important because I think the administration, when David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, was over in Washington a few weeks ago, Obama made it clear that he wanted Britain to stay in the EU and don't rely on this old Anglo-American relationship to be sustained in the old way. You've got to move on. I think the Americans are very, very worried about the disintegration of the European Union, and I think this may be a sub-message coming out maybe at the G8. This is the first thing. Consolidation of defence. This is such a big, sensitive issue. There was a big attempt last year to merge BAE Systems and EADS, which would have been this defence capability that Europe actually needs. The consolidation, the efficiency, and it broke down for political reasons, jobs, political reasons, not for strategic reasons. The British and the French and the Germans saw the strategic and security gains from the consolidation. Politics intervened and killed it off.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
A less serious question. Just about the personal relationships between the heads of state. How important is this chemistry between them? You know, sometimes we see them having a beer on TV and stuff. I mean, is it, if there's more chemistry, will they maybe stay for another 2-3 beers or something like that? Or is it just, okay, we have to share this one beer in front of the TV cameras and then that's it? You know, how important is that personal relationship between them?
Who wants to take a question?
In my experience, it's far more important than you might imagine. And I was not and have never been frequently in contact with world leaders. But I have sat on the back row of many meetings where senior officials have been engaged in important decision-making, both inside the US government as well as in a multinational context. And it is always amazing to me to witness these situations and realize these are just human beings just like you and me. And so you ask yourself, do personal relationships matter in your decision-making? Absolutely, they matter a lot. It is the same for decision makers at high levels. They simply have more power than you do and than I do. And I don't think that those relationships, I think they're rarely decisive, but I think that their importance cannot be underestimated.
I agree with that. I remember a case that we had last year when we really had problems with a country, and the foreign minister visited, and we drew up like talking points for our minister and told him you have to raise this issue, this issue, this issue, and then they met for dinner, and first they had a one-on-one for 5 minutes, but they took a walk for an hour and a half or so, and they got along very, very well, and I think my minister never raised these issues. So everything was very, very harmonious. Yeah. But the issues are still there on the table. Yeah. So on substance, I think even if leaders get along well on a personal level, it rarely helps, I think, sometimes maybe it does, yeah, but sometimes you have fundamental problems, and it's difficult to solve these problems just because you get along well.
Okay.
The Chancellor Chancellor really likes David Cameron. There's something about, they really click, and I've heard this from his entourage. And by the way, I was in the zoo 7 weeks ago after Cameron had visited Merkel in the government place outside Berlin. This would never happen with a US president. There was Cameron with his family looking at the kangaroos. And there was 3 or 4 security 100 meters behind, and you know what, it was wonderful. It was so open, it was so easy. There was, anyway. But so when Merkel goes off to Chequers, that's the residence of the country residence of the British Prime Minister, they do a lot of talking, but they look at television together, and some special, I'm not going to tell you what they look at particularly, he has his DVDs, but they really get on. That, as you're absolutely right, Dave, that does not change Merkel's and Cameron's stance on Europe. And although Merkel gets on very well with the Polish Prime Minister, this has inevitably helped. That has really, Donald Tusk, this has really helped strengthen even further the Polish-German relations. You can, it's like an affair. You can't underestimate personal relations.
What will happen when Barack meets Angela? You know her, you know him. What do you predict? We have some beers?
She likes red wine. It's very, these are very difficult questions. You can second guess whether I don't want to even be presumptuous, but they're both very generous hosts. He's a generous host when Merkel was there, and she will be. I'd love to be there. I bet you would, but it's a very difficult question, actually.
But I think there's actually more underneath it than you might imagine,
yes.
Because it's more than just do the 2 heads of state get along. They are, remember, surrounded by an entourage of people who are constantly at their elbows informing them about the issues that need to be decided upon, and it matters whether those people get along. And you might think, how could anyone ever develop a relationship sitting in front of the cameras, shaking hands 50 times and saying the same talking points over and over again? But whatever chemistry they can develop in those moments becomes critically important in moments of crisis when they're not sitting face to face, when the interaction that makes a decision is a phone call. So think about it for yourself. When you pick up the phone and you have to call somebody and you have to tell them something you know that they don't want to hear, it's much easier if you have a relationship with that person than if you've met them once and you're cold. This is the same for people with huge amounts of power. It just happens to have more significance. And these very human factors, I think, are often underestimated in politics despite their importance. It's why the president took such pains to hang out in the desert with the new leader of China. It's a very strange thing to do if you look at it objectively, but when you see this sort of subjective lens on it, and you see that these people, both the heads of state and their teams, are going to have a lot to deal with one another over the course of the next 4 years, it makes a lot of sense. It's like a pledge week in a frat. You all go away and hang out together.
Okay, we don't have a desert, but we have a Spreewald. Oh.
Nice.
Unfortunately, our time has run out. Judy, Ben, David, thank you very much for your time and for your insight. And to the audience, thank you very much for your contributions. Deutsche Welle is reporting about the panel discussion and also reporting about the several issues we mentioned. So I would like to invite you to have a look on our webpage, dw.de. Thank you very much.
Thank you.